Good afternoon. Welcome to the first seminar of the spring semester. Before introducing the speaker, I'd like to thank Brad Lee for suggesting that we invite her and for arranging all of the logistics of her visit. So thanks, Brad, for that. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Heidi Peterson. Heidi is the Phosphorus Program Director of the International Plant Nutrition Institute, a position that she has held for 4 months now, I think you said, Heidi, right? And in that position, she's working on all kinds of national and international issues relating to agricultural phosphorus use. Heidi got her BS degree in Natural Resource and Environmental Sciences at Purdue University, and then stayed at Purdue for her MS in agronomy, and then went to University of Minnesota for her PhD in biosystems and ag engineering. She then spent some time as a consultant, soil and groundwater remediation control, and then became a soil science instructor at University of Wisconsin River Falls, after which she became a research scientist for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, working with a group that developed best management practices for water, what's the term I'm looking for here, water issues, impaired water issues. During this time, Heidi was part of a number of groups that involved stakeholders, researchers, industry folks, as well as policymakers. And since 2013, she has actively collaborated as a member of the NSF Phosphorus Sustainability Research Coordination Network that is centered at Arizona State University. And she's also an adjunct faculty member in the Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering Department at the University of Minnesota. Today, she's going to present a seminar, the title of which is up here on the screen. So please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming here today. And I've enjoyed my visit here in Lexington so far, and it was great to have the opportunity to meet some of the faculty and also the students. So thank you very much for the great welcome. As you heard, some of my background, I wanted to bring up that when I was at Purdue University and working on my bachelor's and then moving on to my master's, Dr. Lee was actually my major advisor for my master's degree. So it was great to be here and see where he's working now and the projects that he's involved in. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the work that I'm involved with at the International Plant Nutrition Institute. I thought that it'd be great to begin with an introduction of what IPNI is all about. So IPNI, it's a nonprofit and supported by the leading fertilizer manufacturers that you can see here on the screen. It's a research and education organization, and the mission is to develop and promote science for the responsible management of crop nutrition. So in some of the discussions that I had with you throughout the day and talking about what IPNI is involved with, some of you may have worked with the Fertilizer Institute, so TFI. So when you look at IPNI compared to TFI, we work very closely together. TFI often is involved in more of the policy side of the fertilizer and nutrient management issues. And then IPNI provides that research and education background. So when I bring up the members here, what we're providing is if any of our members have a question regarding some of the new research that's out there or questions that they're hearing from crop retailers or CCAs, then they may come to us and say, can you investigate this? Can you coordinate some of the research behind it? And so that's what IPNI is involved with, is moving forward some of the practices and some of the research that is being done at the universities and educating and outreach with the results that we're seeing too. A little bit more about the Institute. Oops. Okay. We have 25 scientists located across the world, and when you look at where we're all placed geographically, our programs really center around where we're located within the world. And we have, as I was introduced, I'm the Phosphorus Program Director, but that doesn't mean that I can't talk about.
Sorry, I'll just get you on the call.
That I can't. Hello there.
Hi.
Hi. That doesn't mean that I can't talk about other nutrients or other issues. It just means that when you look at, and I'll just flip forward and then I'll go back here. If you look at all of the projects that we are involved in based by the nutrients, you can see that most of them focus around NP and K. So the largest distribution of our projects fall within nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And so we do have a researcher assigned to nitrogen and phosphorus, and then we have potassium. But based on where we're located geographically, we're also going to be involved in some of the teams that are discussing local issues. And so, for example, lately I've been pulled into a lot of the discussions regarding 4R certification and the issues within the Red River Basin, Mississippi River Basin, Lake Erie. And so that's how regionally we get involved in projects as well. I've stressed to a number of you in our introductions today the work that we're doing around metrics. And so what this diagram here represents is the support that we provide within IP&I to address and support the industry around sustainability issues. So this is a diagram for nutrient stewardship metrics for sustainable crop nutrition. And if you look here on the right, we have the enabler. So that's all of us in this room. So extension and professionals, the infrastructure, research and innovation, stakeholder engagement. In the middle here is the actions. So around nutrient management, what I'm promoting is the proper use of crop nutrients, okay, the responsible use of crop nutrients. And so where I'm really going to try to stress the actions that we want to see are the adoption of the 4Rs. So placing fertilizer at the right place, the right time, the right source, and the right rate. I remembered all 4 of them. So 4 months, I better know it by now. And then the outcomes, those metrics that as an industry, we need to do better about really documenting. And what I'm hearing a lot of you are doing with the work that you're funded on or that you're looking for funding on is really identifying how productive are we in the ag industry? What is the soil health? And so we have 9 different outcome metrics that we're measuring to see how successful we are at implementing these 4Rs. And when we look at the negative metrics that we're quantifying, that would be number 4, 5, and 6. So the water, air, and greenhouse gases. Okay, and so that could be tile drainage water, it could be surface runoff for the water quality. And what I'll do next is then define it based on phosphorus and the issues that we're really dealing with in terms of monitoring and measuring for phosphorus is what are our crop yields, how is it affecting soil health, or how does soil health help with the availability of phosphorus, nutrient use efficiency, quantifying nutrient balances, and then that water quality falls into the phosphorus. I'm assuming you all know why we are looking at phosphorus, and it is important for agricultural productivity. It's the key to life. It's a component of every living plant and animal cell. It's really important when you look at when we apply it and think about the timing. It's really important at the beginning of the beginning part of the growing season with root formation and growth. It helps improve the quality of the fruit and vegetable crops. So when you look at antioxidants in some of our vegetables or tomatoes, the flavonoids in tomatoes, a lot of that comes from the phosphorus that's taken up. It's vital to seed formation. It helps improve water use and hasten maturity as well. Phosphorus is taken up by the crops primarily as orthophosphate. And so I wanted to point that out because you'll see that come up later on in the presentation as well. And when we look at how much is actually consumed within the US versus worldwide, so just under 2 million metric tons of phosphorus is used, and that's based on 2015 data from the International Fertilizer Association. And then worldwide, over 20 million metric tons of phosphorus is consumed. So we know the benefits of using phosphorus and how much is being used, but why focus on it? Why do we care about phosphorus? I thought we only cared about nitrogen. Nitrates leach, right? They're mobile. Well, everything in moderation, right? Well, and that includes our phosphorus. Eutrophication, it's a natural process. However, if crops are using orthophosphorus and we start to have dissolved phosphorus coming out into our lakes, rivers, streams, what's going to happen? Well, those aquatic plants are going to use that phosphorus also. And that's going to speed up the eutrophication process. So those nutrient additions accelerate that process. Phosphorus, even though it wasn't until more recently that the Gulf of Mexico, the Hypoxia Task Force really started looking at phosphorus also. When we looked at the Mississippi River Basin original reports, like in 1997, they didn't even talk about phosphorus. It was just nitrogen as that limiting factor for hypoxia and eutrophication. But research over the last 10, 15 years is really talking about what happens when phosphorus is thrown into the mix. And that's often the limiting element. So dissolved oxygen starts to become depleted by that excess plant growth in our water systems. And there's been a lot of research and work looking at like particulate phosphorus and minimizing the losses of particulate phosphorus with no-till or leaving plant residues on the fields. And there are structural best management practices that can help mitigate some of the losses of particulate phosphorus. But what we're finding is some of these best management practices have had some unintended consequences. And some of the work that I'm going to show you today that IP&I has funded through our partners is getting at some of these unintended consequences and what do we need to do in order to mitigate the problem. I thought I would start with this graphic here from the Hypoxia Task Force 2017 report to Congress. And it shows you some baseline data that was collected between 1980 and 1996. Let's see if I can get this pointer working. Maybe not. There it is. Okay, so there's your baseline. All right, when you look at where we are with the total phosphorus flux, so that phosphorus load to the Gulf of Mexico, we're actually not decreasing. So the goal is to reduce it by 45%. And then let's see, up until 2025, if we can meet at least that 20% reduction. But what the results are showing is that actually we've increased by 13%. And if you look at the average over the moving average over the last 5 years, so that we're at an increasing trend instead of a decreasing trend. Now, if we move forward to looking at orthophosphorus, again, the dissolved phosphorus that's available to plants, that we're seeing even a greater increase. So we're above 20% from that baseline. All right, so we're increasing, we have an increasing trend instead of the decreasing trend that we see like with nitrate. So that's why lately we're seeing a lot of additional focus and research interest in phosphorus because our trends are not going in the direction we want them to. And so looking at what can we do with our practices and the way that we manage our system to reduce those impacts. I want to show you some of the products that IPNI has available, and a lot of you are graduate students, and when I first got familiarized with IPNI, it was because of the products. As I was putting my dissertation together, I was finding some great resources online. I'm like, well, who is this group anyways? And so I wanted to get the word out about some of the databases that we have available for all of you to use. And to do that, and disregard the Department of Ag logo there on the bottom. I'm not sure how that ended up carrying through on this slide. Something got messed up, but this work here, it's been done all over the United States to show these relationships between soil phosphorus and then the soluble phosphorus that's being the losses from the fields. This is one study that was done by Vatis in 2005, and I know that there's been some done here in state as well. And it's looking at a meta-analysis of some box studies, so in the lab, and also some field studies as well. And you can see that there's this strong relationship between soil test phosphorus and then the losses that come off of the fields, whether it's a plot or actually what's measured on an actual farm. And I wanted to show that here as we move forward, because then you'll start to put together, if you don't have a background in phosphorus, just that understanding of why we are encouraging and promoting some of the practices. This is one of the resources that we have available on our website. So soil test levels in North America. So there's actually a whole handbook that you could purchase, but then there's a database that you can actually use for free online. And what that provides is a summary of what the soil test levels are for your state. There's about 61 labs that IPNI works with and coordinates the data. The labs volunteer to send the data over to us, and then we can plug it in to our database to actually look at where the trends, our soil test levels increasing or decreasing, and then compare that to the critical level. And within our manual, what we say the critical level is the soil test level where recommended nutrient rates generally drop to 0 in sufficiency approaches or to a crop removal level in build maintenance approaches. So if you look here on the left, this is the critical Bray phosphorus soil test levels. And then on the right, that's where the median soil test levels are. So for Kentucky, it shows 17 parts per million, but where the median soil test level is showing 15 parts per million. And I put this here, but I'm going to zoom in to where the median soil test level is. And so again, you can see Kentucky is about 17 here, 15 for the median soil test level. And when you compare over the last 5 years, well, between 2010 and 2015, that value has actually declined. So the median soil test level has dropped by 3. And I know, hearing from some of you with the research and the data that's been collected, there's some similar trends in what you're seeing in soil test levels and some of the ag communities. But I want you to look at it from a whole distribution of all the soil samples that were submitted from Kentucky. So this is a pretty impressive database here. For 2015, we had over 183,000 samples submitted. And this is looking at the soil test level and then the percentage of samples. So 12% of the samples are at critical level. 49% below the critical level, okay, meaning that there will be an advantage, a crop yield advantage, if additional phosphorus is applied. And then look over at this far end here. You can see that there's quite a high level of samples that are well above 50 parts per million, but there was a decline. And so when we look at that drop that I showed you where the critical level was and then the decline that we're observing, so those that have been over applying, there is a decline. And so hopefully we continue to see a reduction in those high level concentrations and more, a larger quantity of samples coming in around that critical level. This is another database that I wanted to introduce you to. This is called NUGIS. This is a GIS-based database that allows you to look at nutrient balances. This map here is depicted based on watershed levels. You can go in by county or look at it from the state perspective as well. If it's shown in green, that means that there's low efficiency for phosphorus. If it's the yellows, the reds, that means there's high efficiency. So what that means is that if you're in the greens, that means that you're potentially over applying phosphorus, so your inputs are less than what's coming off of the field. Your inputs are greater than what's coming off of the field. If it's toward this yellow, orange, red color, that means that you're potentially mining the soil phosphorus. The phosphorus has been stored up in the soils because your inputs are less than what's actually being harvested off of the field. So people look at this and think, okay, well, one is sustainable. Well, depends on where you're at. If you're at a 1, you could also be in an area of the world or the county or the state where there's low fertility. And in that case, it's not necessarily sustainable because you're not maximizing the potential. You're just putting in what's coming out. And also operating your system at a very high phosphorus use efficiency isn't necessarily efficient either, because if you start to mine down the soils below the critical level, then you're going to have a problem also. And so this kind of stresses that importance of soil testing and, really applying your nutrients based on what the soil test levels are telling you and what the crop needs are. And here's just, I tried to zoom in so you can see that depiction across the state as well. And looking at a map of where there's a lot of dairy and poultry manure, you can see that western half of the state looks to be at a lower efficiency. So the inputs are higher than what's coming off the field. And I'm guessing that some of that has to do with not accounting for the manure when nitrogen is applied. I'm not going to go into depth on this because Dr. McGrath is in the audience here and he can speak about his research a lot better than I would be able to do its justice. But IPNI does fund research. So the funds that we receive from our member companies, that goes then to fund research to address some of the crop nutrition questions that we hear from producers or from our members. So one of the projects that has recently been funded was here to the department, working with Josh McGrath and James Bowen on the question of, do critical soil phosphorus concentrations vary in space, and if so, how? And what this gets down to is looking at how the frequency of soil sampling, and then also how do we incorporate that into some of the variable rate applications for fertilizer that's being done within the state. And I imagine this is going to have quite a broad impact across the region in terms of some of the other, the states along the Mississippi River as well. I mean, there's been quite an increase in the number of co-ops and retailers that are promoting variable phosphorus applications, variable rate phosphorus applications. And so understanding what's the best way to soil sample, and then how do we integrate that into refining the resolution of our applications will be very beneficial to a large audience. So the questions are, do soil phosphorus critical concentrations vary in space and time? Can traditional soil testing be used to estimate variable soil phosphorus critical concentrations and prescribe spatially variable phosphorus fertilizer rates? And then lastly, what soil chemical and biological factors as well as rhizosphere processes control crop phosphorus requirements? So stay tuned, and as this project continues, and if you have questions, then I'll let you go talk to Dr. McGrath about those. Another project that I wanted to show you today is quite a large project that involves a number of collaborators. And this one is looking at basically evaluating those 4R nutrient stewardship concepts and certification programs in the Western Lake Erie Basin. So the practices that are being promoted for, again, the right place, source, timing, rate of the nutrients, and how do we adjust those practices to see the greatest environmental impact, the beneficial impact. This was funded to Kevin King with the ARS. One of the most recent publications that came out of the study, and the study has a couple more years, so 2 more years, and there's been quite a few publications that have been coming out of it, but the most recent one I wanted to highlight is looking at the right place. So looking at tile drains and fertilizer placement. And again, thinking about how our thoughts on phosphorus and how phosphorus moves has changed. Before, we used to think that we didn't have to worry about phosphorus moving in the landscape, but that's also assuming that it's being able to be absorbed and that have that contact with the soil right away, and it's not running off prior to that. So they're looking at comparing preferential flow and phosphorus leachate concentrations in a no-till versus a tilled field. They looked at surface broadcast versus injected versus incorporating that phosphorus fertilizer. So when I say incorporated, that means once it was broadcasted, it was also then tilled into the system to increase that soil contact. The site is located in northwestern Ohio in the Maumee River watershed. I mentioned that this is an area where there's tile drainage, so it's a very flat, poorly drained area. So silt loam, silty clay loam soils. It's in a corn, soybean, and there was one field that I believe had a corn, soybean, wheat rotation. And then I just put some details in there about the tile spacing and depth. So just right around 3-foot depth, and then about 35 to 45-foot spacing for those tiles. Fertilizer source used was MAP, and that was applied at 75 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare. And again, they looked at no-till broadcast, and then that incorporated with tillage, and then with injecting it. They use some pan lysimeters to collect what was the water that was leaching through, and to be able to quantify how much phosphorus was in that leachate. And they use rainfall simulators, which I think is great because then you aren't relying on Mother Nature to produce the rainfall when you need it. And they conducted the rainfall simulation right after applying the fertilizer. They also looked at installing plot borders so that they could collect the surface runoff as well. So looking at what their results showed, the mean dissolved reactive phosphorus concentration, or that orthophosphorus, was significantly greater for the broadcast treatment. The particulate phosphorus was also significantly greater for the broadcast treatment. And again, whoops, wrong button. Again, this is in the tile drains. And some of this research has been, it's something that, is not, this part isn't necessarily new in terms of what's coming off from the surface, but in terms of quantifying it, from the tile line and what's moving through the profile. That's what was some of the newer research, but incorporating it also with how tillage added to it. So tillage did not significantly influence the event water transport. So a lot of the previous thought was that this disruption of the macropore network was what was the primary mechanism responsible for reducing the amount of leachate. But what they actually found with some of the analyses that they did and summarized in the paper that came out, that it was the differences in the soil fertilizer water contact and that soil phosphorus sorption capacity, and then also the proximal phosphorus availability. Those were the primary factors that resulted in the reduced phosphorus leaching. And then this final bullet here is getting at, okay, well, some of the work that came out a couple years ago said, okay, well, in all these areas that we had no till, now we have to start tilling it because we're seeing a stratification of phosphorus and we're seeing increases of the dissolved phosphorus coming out. So then people started thinking, oh, great. So now we have to start tilling. Like, how do we go from no till to tilling? Well, what the results are showing is that actually, if you just inject the fertilizer, then you have that same result as if it's tilled with the broadcast application. And so it's the work is really showing that in these fine textured soils, you might be able to limit that dissolved phosphorus leaching and the surface disturbance just by injecting the fertilizer. And so that's kind of the message, instead of, instead of saying, okay, start tilling up all your fields. No, that's not what we're saying. But if we look at these other ways to apply the fertilizer, that will help us minimize our impact. Another project that I thought would be of interest to many of you is looking at phosphorus loss with forest stewardship together with cover crops. And this was a project that was funded through the 4R Research Fund that, again, just like the previous project. So IP&I together with TFI and the fertilizer industry funds this research, and it goes into some of the FR work that's being done. And so this is on cover crops, and it is in Kansas and funded to Nathan Nelson with the university. The question that he was trying to answer was how will cover crops and fertilizer management impact phosphorus loss, phosphorus use efficiency, crop yield, and net return? So he was looking at 3 points, and the study is still ongoing. I'm going to show you some of the results from the first year, but he has a couple more years that he'll be looking at the site. How much does fertilizer placement affect phosphorus loss? When at the right time? Will cover crops reduce phosphorus loss and no-till? And will cover crops reduce phosphorus loss from surface broadcast fertilizer? He was looking at a no-till corn-soybean rotation, and the treatments that he was looking at was just a control with no phosphorus applied, and then a 55 pounds of fall broadcast, and then a 55-pound application injected at planting. There was no cover crop, and then there were also a couple of varieties with the winter wheat cover, and then one with a triticale and rapeseed. When I went out to visit the plots a couple months ago, I was really impressed. So this is an air photo. There's 6 different treatments, 3 replicates, so there's 18 individual plots here, and it's on this nice hill slope. So it's great because you can actually quantify the runoff that's coming out, and there's a great slope. So at each of these red points, that's the watershed outlet, or so receiving the runoff from each of those plots. And so it's really a great opportunity to be able to quantify losses from a variety of treatments, and not have to worry about trying to find a paired watershed, because it's all right there in one easy to get to plot. Each plot was set up with a flume and then also an automated sampler. And they were measuring runoff, sediment, total phosphorus, dissolved phosphorus, and then also the farmland productivity, looking at the yields, the costs, and the net returns. Because that's often the question that we get is, all right, well, this is the water quality result, but what about the return on the investment? And so there's also that component. Looking at the data from 2016 and 2017, when we looked at the addition of cover crops, there was a decrease in erosion by about 70%. But looking at the total phosphorus reduction, yeah, there wasn't a real consistent pattern. However, when you break it out from particulate versus orthophosphorus, there was a decrease of 40% in the particulate phosphorus. However, the increase in the dissolved phosphorus of 65%. So, okay, what do we do? Then he started to look at all the plots together with those 4 R's. And so looking at how are we placing the fertilizer? And by looking at a fall broadcast versus a spring injected, there was a 30% decrease in the total phosphorus with that spring injection. And 45% in that dissolved phosphorus. So again, that goes to show that, you know, it's so important to look at how are we managing our nutrients? How are we applying them to our fields? And that can't be left out of the discussion as we're talking about the addition of cover crops or the practices that we're applying, you know, if we're using a grass waterway or if we're doing, you know, tillage. We need to really be thinking about the whole system and how all of these components work together. And I bring that up with this slide. It's some work that's been pulled together recently by Dodd and Sharpley and summarized, and you know, gets at when we look at some of the practices that we've been promoting in the past, it might be very beneficial in terms of the reductions for particulate phosphorus. But again, when we're looking at those graphs from the hypoxia task force showing that increasing trend in phosphorus and that increasing trend in the dissolved phosphorus or the orthophosphorus, we really need to be thinking holistically and look at how are we managing the source, the rate, the time, the place of our nutrients. There's a wide range in the efficacy that does require site-specific focus and additional research. And again, just that reminder that that trade-off between a practice that will help the particulate to that dissolved is really important to keep in mind. So doom and gloom, everybody. No, not doom and gloom. We can focus on reducing the losses at the source. And I wanted to wrap up here kind of highlighting a research group that came together. There were 19 scientists, including Dr. McGrath, about a year and a half ago that came together and met to discuss what are the 4R practices that should be adopted based on region across the United States to really minimize the loss and to increase the use, the efficient use of phosphorus. So we'll focus here on the eastern cereals and oil seeds, since that's where Kentucky falls into place. I just wanted to quick highlight this. I'm working on a paper right now that summarizes all the recommendations that were compiled, but there is a issue review on IPNI's website by Tom Brulsma that summarizes what the group's outcomes were and what these practices are based on region. But within this area, so including Kentucky, we have the basic would be really knowing what you're applying, okay, that guaranteed analysis. So again, if you're applying other sources of nutrients, having an analysis that goes along with it. The rate, recommended soil sampling, soil test interpretation, the timing, avoid frozen and snow-covered soils, and apply when there's a low runoff risk. The placement, subsurface band is really encouraged, and I had that research that shows why we're encouraging that. And on surface only when it's a low runoff risk. Now, if we move to more intermediate, so this with each, basic, intermediate, advanced, that means that we have less potential for losses. So with source, again, paying attention not only to what the fertilizer application rate is, but then also knowing the analysis that goes along with the manure that's being applied. The rate using a phosphorus index, and then anticipating the crop removal based on past crop yields. So have a feel for what the system has produced in the past. Timing, again, expanding to the use of the phosphorus index and applying the nutrient close to or at planting. And then placement, maybe using a starter fertilizer in addition to what's been recommended with the basic. Advanced builds upon the intermediate recommendations. Then also when it comes down to the rate, looking at a zone-specific recommendation based on loss potential and the crop response, and again, using that phosphorus index. Timing and placement using that phosphorus index. And then lastly, I want to make sure to include adaptive management. Okay, so our systems aren't stationary. Okay, we manage together with the climate, and so having that adaptive management. So decisions are site specific and adaptive to changing conditions. So not everything can be written down here because we're in the changing system. And so really making changes as we know what our conditions are. So with that, I want to summarize with 3 main points. The losses of phosphorus, small relative to the inputs and outputs, do impact water quality. Site-specific for our phosphorus practices, limit dissolved losses and need to be synergized together with conservation practices controlling particulate losses. And then quantification of practice impacts on phosphorus losses is important to enabling sustainability investment decisions. And so leaving on those 3 notes, I want to welcome future interactions with the department. It's been just great getting to know all of you and hearing what some of the projects are that you have moving forward. And I also want to mention that one of my roles as I look at the research that's being generated and getting the outreach and the informing the public about the value of the research that's being done and what it actually means, one of my roles is to develop articles. So if you go to IPNI's website, which I'll flip ahead here, ipni.net, if you go to our website, you'll see our Better Crops magazine. It used to be something that came out in print, and now we'll be doing it in an electronic downloadable format. But I'm always looking for research that's coming out that I could help work with a researcher, students, and summarize it in a simplified format that will appeal to the general public, crop consultants, producers, that really emphasize, here's what we could do to promote the proper use of crop nutrients and some of the best management practices involved. And so if you have research that you want to share with me, please do send me an email. I hope to come back again soon to visit the campus. So thank you so much for having me here, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
I've heard a lot over the years about there's just a 50 or 100-year supply of phosphorus. What are the current projections?
Well, I'd have to look to see what the projections are now, but I think what a lot of the early estimates, so some of the work that came out 10 years ago or so, that started to talk about the limited reserves. A lot of those have been revised by the same group that put out those original estimations, and I think that what it comes down to is there's a lot more available than what was originally believed.
Okay.
And there are a lot of groups. Part of that research group that got me really pulled into the phosphorus discussion that Phosphorus Research Coordination Network is continuing into a sustainability alliance. And so they're continuing to meet and have discussions about really making it more of a circular economy and keeping the phosphorus in the system longer. So if there's, food waste, keeping the food waste out of the landfills, trying to figure out a way to get it back in, maybe fed to our livestock, or put in a form that can be land applied or whatever. And what I say in those discussions is, all right, as long as there's, if we're talking about reusable products that are going to be placed back on the landscape, that it's going to be so important that we know what actually is in it in terms of what that nutrient analysis is, because it really needs to be handled the same way as our current nutrient sources. So I can't answer the question about, what are our projected, reserves now, but it's a lot more hopeful than it was when some of that initial work came out. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have just a comment about the phosphorus. Like, as you mentioned that in your whole slide, there is a difference between dissolved phosphorus and particulate phosphorus, right? Particulate phosphorus coming into dissolved phosphorus one or other way. So in my opinion, the future research, one of the important future research would be understanding how these phosphorus are dissolved. Like you have a different pools of phosphorus that are unavailable for plants. Sometimes they become available from organic phosphorus as well and inorganic as well. And that direction of research is, I think, the most important to understand. Then only we will come to know, okay, particulate, you have this much particulate, this much dissolved, because these dissolves are coming from those particulates. How they are coming, what's happening in the farm while it's growing, like plants and crops are growing there. So that kind of connections.
Yeah, when we look at the biogeochemistry involved with the cycling of phosphorus, I think that the direction that the research is going, and with what is being generated and published now in the peer-reviewed journals, and you just see the new interest coming in and looking at this topic. I think that there's going to be a lot to be explored in understanding how it's cycling in the landscape, and what's contributing, and what, how can we, there's soil amendments out there that can be used to help reduce the amount that's becoming, transforming into that dissolved fraction. And so I agree. I'm already seeing added interest in that area. And that's one of the things, I'll get questions often, especially when when there's graphs like from that hypoxia task force showing that increasing trend, that I often remind people that, when you look at our trends, you have to remember from the agricultural perspective, what has happened also over time. We're increasing our yield and our productivity, and in some areas we're not seeing those. It really depends on what scale you're looking at in terms of what the trends are and what we're finding. When you look at some of the watersheds that have had a lot of practices implemented and work, and looking at how applying nutrients at the right the right amount and using soil tests, we have to remember that we're also working with changing rainfall and precipitation patterns. So there's not only one variable, so you can't pinpoint what exactly is the issue and what's contributing to it, because there's all of these factors. And as we see earlier extreme rainfall events in the spring, when there's still snow on the fields, there are a lot of questions, and how do we manage that dissolved component of the phosphorus?
Other questions for Heidi? Heidi, why don't you see Princeton?
Oh, Princeton?
No questions here. Thank you.
Questions? Thank you. All right. Oh, yes.
Has there been any specific work with permeable reactor
You know, so I can't answer that question specifically, but some of the technology where you're looking at like tile drains and some of the practices that are being implemented. You know, a lot of our practices when we look at drainage water, it's been to reduce nitrates because of the mobility of nitrates. Well, now in trying to look at, well, how do we adjust our practices to also treat for phosphorus and the dissolved phosphorus? There's been, you know, bioreactors that have been designed so that there's materials that will absorb the phosphorus, the dissolved component of the phosphorus, and help to treat it. So it's not, you know, a barrier necessarily, but it's a method to, you know, the water can move through the system and then it'll help to pull some of that dissolved phosphorus out of the water. So there's practices that are being designed right now to help treat it. And I think that those practices will continue. You know, that's, you know, thinking about, and I should have brought this up earlier in some of the discussions with like the legacy phosphorus and, you know, some of the trends that, you know, we might be seeing increases, and some of it has to do with practices that we were doing 20 years ago. We were building up these high soil test